Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank SGI for organizing this great event. The conversation has already been very good so far, and I also enjoyed the presentations of the previous panel and the earlier speakers. My address today to help inform this conversation is titled "The Humanitarian Imperative to Accelerate Progress on Nuclear Disarmament and Non-Proliferation." And I'm going to start by talking a little bit more in detail about the current state of affairs, providing my perspective on some of the things we heard about earlier from Anita Fried from the State Department. And then I'm going to discuss some ideas for next steps, for some actions that can accelerate progress on nuclear disarmament towards a nuclear weapons-free world at this very difficult time. But let me start by noting and reflecting on some of the things we heard about this morning from Dr. Andy Cantor from Physicians for Social Responsibility, an organization I'm proud to say that I used to work for in the 1990s. For decades, it's been well understood that the direct effects of a large-scale nuclear conflict could result in several 100 million human fatalities, while the indirect effects would be far greater. We heard about that in detail involving a India-Pakistan scenario from Dr. Cantor. And partly because of that, through the decades, the public and policymakers have worked to reduce the risk of nuclear war, and the threat of a U.S.-Russian nuclear conflict has indeed decreased, but the risk of nuclear war elsewhere in different scenarios in other regions of the world has, I would say, grown. And as we heard earlier, the use of nuclear weapons would result in humanitarian emergencies beyond the immediate target zones of the warring parties. And such attacks would, in my view and the view of many other international legal scholars, violate the basic principles of international humanitarian law, including the avoidance of attacks that could affect civilians indiscriminately. And so the catastrophic impact of nuclear weapons use make these weapons, from a security standpoint, an enormous global liability. Nevertheless, 9 states and several of their allies still employ nuclear weapons as part of their military and security doctrines. Now, because of these realities, the 2010 Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference final document expresses, and I quote, "deep concern at the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons and the need for all states to comply with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law." The NPT nuclear weapons states in 2010 also committed to, quote, "diminish the role and significance of nuclear weapons and to discuss policies that could prevent the use of nuclear weapons." And the final document from 2010 also commits the states parties to certain actions to reduce the risk of such an outcome, including some 22 overlapping disarmament and nonproliferation measures, which include changes in nuclear doctrines to diminish the role of nuclear weapons, reductions in the number of all types of nuclear weapons, changes in the operational readiness of nuclear weapons to reduce the risk of accidental nuclear war, increased transparency and reporting by the nuclear weapons states, tangible progress towards ratification and entry into force of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and overcoming the so-called paralysis of the UN's disarmament machinery, also known as the impasse at the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva on discussing key disarmament and nonproliferation issues. Now, the ability of the 2010 Review Conference to reach agreement on this action plan was in itself an important breakthrough. But as I'll outline very briefly, the follow-through on that action plan has been overall disappointing and frustrating. The United States and Russia, as we heard from Anita Fried earlier, did successfully negotiate, sign, and ratify the New START Treaty in 2010. That was an enormous accomplishment. It was a difficult accomplishment. And that treaty requires the two countries to make modest but important reductions in their deployed strategic arsenals to 1,550 deployed strategic warheads and 700 strategic delivery systems by 2018. Since then, however, with respect to the United States and Russia, progress has slowed, and progress on most of the key steps outlined in the 2010 disarmament section of the action plan has slowed to a crawl. The U.S. and Russia have obviously begun to implement the New START treaty reductions. They continue inspections and information exchanges under the treaty despite the problems relating to despite the problems in Ukraine. This is hard to do. I'll continue. There's a little echo for those of you watching online. All right, but since 2011, the United States and Russia have not made progress towards reductions below the New START ceilings. In 2013, President Putin rebuffed Barack Obama's proposal to slash U.S. and Russian deployed strategic arsenals by another third below New START ceilings, which would theoretically bring the two countries' deployed arsenals, strategic arsenals, down to 1,000 deployed warheads. And of course, since the problems in Ukraine, tensions have only increased between Moscow and Washington, and it is quite clear that in the short term, it's going to be very difficult to resume the formal nuclear reductions dialogue between the U.S. and Russia. So as a result, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, new informal but still verifiable approaches to reduce bloated U.S. and Russian nuclear stockpiles, I think, are in order. Now, another area where there has been a lack of progress is with respect to reducing the tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. Both the U.S. tactical nuclear weapons in 5 NATO countries, as well as Russia's tactical nuclear arsenal, which is larger than the U.S. weapons, which number about 180. Now, in its 2012 Deterrence and Defense Posture Review, NATO declared its intention to engage Russia in a process of confidence building on tactical nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, since then, NATO has been unable to produce a common proposal for accounting and transparency for U.S. and Russian tactical nuclear weapons. So the first task is for NATO to agree amongst itself about how to approach Russia. Now, there are other things I could talk about in the action plan, but suffice to say that many other areas there have been delays or a lack of progress. At the same time, nuclear weapons competition, also known as nuclear weapons modernization, continues among the world's nuclear-armed states. And as Hans Christensen, who's one of the most expert bean counters of nuclear arsenals around the world, writes in a forthcoming issue in our journal Arms Control Today, he writes and documents that all of the world's nuclear-armed states are busy modernizing their arsenals, continue to reaffirm the importance of such weapons, and none of them appear willing to eliminate their nuclear weapons in the foreseeable future. The United States alone is scheduled to spend in excess of $355 billion over the next decade on maintaining, replacing, and upgrading its nuclear warheads and delivery systems. In another key area, progress on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty entry into force has stalled due to lack of action on the part of the United States and China, the 2 of the P5 countries who have signed but not yet ratified the treaty. Without action by the U.S. and China, other states necessary for entry into force will be much less inclined to accede to the treaty, and it's more likely that North Korea will conduct a 4th nuclear test explosion, perhaps sometime in the near future. And so as a result of the inability of the Obama administration to make progress in re-engaging the Senate in a conversation about the CTBT, the door to the renewal of nuclear testing and new and more deadly types of nuclear weapons remains open. So taking all this into account, I think many of you would agree that the current state of affairs regarding nuclear disarmament and nonproliferation is unsustainable. President Obama himself noted in April 2009 that our efforts to contain these dangers are centered on the global nuclear nonproliferation regime, but we could reach a point where the center cannot hold. The conferences on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons in Oslo and in Mexico over the past 2 years are, among other things, a symptom of the growing impatience regarding the agonizingly slow pace of action by the nuclear-armed states to meet their nuclear disarmament obligations and commitments. And as the 2015 review conference of the NPT approaches, the pressure to accelerate action on disarmament and the frustration, if there isn't any action, is only going to grow. And as was mentioned in the Q&A session this morning, one expression of that growing frustration is the Republic of the Marshall Islands lawsuit against the world's 9 nuclear-armed countries for their failure for meeting their nuclear disarmament obligations and commitments. That's truly a David versus Goliath effort, but it's one to be commended. Now, as government officials, parliamentarians, civil society and religious leaders, we have to consider how to jumpstart action on meaningful, practical measures that can challenge the dangerous nuclear doctrines of the nuclear-armed states and reduce the risk and eventually eliminate the risk of catastrophic nuclear war. I would agree with the speakers earlier this morning that the world's leaders and we have a moral, legal, and international security obligation to make good faith efforts around new and practical approaches to jumpstart progress. And I believe that more than one path can and must be pursued to accomplish this. The humanitarian conferences, the conferences on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons are a useful, important venue for dialogue that should be welcomed by the nuclear-armed countries. I was glad to hear Anita Fried this morning say that the United States is still open to participation in the Vienna conference, though they will need to see what the agenda looks like before they make a decision. These conferences have already and can continue to play a powerful role in increasing awareness as well as political will on nuclear disarmament. So rather than dismiss the conferences that's scheduled, the conference that's scheduled for Vienna, Austria in December, I believe quite strongly that the United States and the other nuclear-armed countries should participate actively and support statements that come out of that conference and others warning of the consequences of nuclear weapons use. And at the same time, the countries that are active in these conferences need to better utilize the dialogue to develop and come together around proposals that more effectively challenge the nuclear-armed states and their nuclear weapons employment policies. So what I'm about to present are some ideas. There are many others. This is a very smart audience, and I'd like to hear your comments and your thoughts about some other ideas, but I would like to present several ideas that can be pursued in the short and medium term to accelerate progress on the stalled effort to eliminate the nuclear threat. So the first thing I think that needs to be considered is how we can, and how especially non-nuclear weapon states can engage the P5, the 5 original nuclear-armed states, in a discussion on the impacts of their nuclear weapons use plans. Before the 2015 review conference, the nuclear weapon states could be called upon to explain the effects of their nuclear weapons use doctrines and war plans if they were to be carried out, and to explain how the use of such weapons would be consistent, or would not be, with international human rights and humanitarian law. It's interesting to see in the June 2013 report on nuclear weapons employment strategy of the United States that was issued by the Pentagon in response to President Obama's decisions about revising U.S. Nuclear policy, it claims that, quote, all plans must be also consistent with the fundamental principles of the law of armed conflict. Accordingly, plans will, for example, apply the principles of distinction and proportionality and seek to minimize collateral damage to civilian populations and civilian objects. The United States will not intentionally target civilian populations or civilian objects. Now, the NPT nuclear weapon states should as part of their reporting responsibilities at the 2015 NPT Review Conference, report in detail on how their nuclear weapons employment policies would play out, so that other states parties of the treaty can evaluate whether such practices are or are not consistent with international humanitarian law. As we heard this morning from Anita Fried, and we would hear if we had other representatives of the P5 here, they all say in some form or another that nuclear weapons use would only be considered in extreme circumstances. Well, what I'm proposing is that we have an adult, serious conversation with the governments of the nuclear armed states about what are those circumstances. Are you really serious about this? Is this really consistent with the principles that you claim your nuclear weapons employment practices respect? Now, especially if the P5 states do not participate in the Vienna Conference on Humanitarian Consequences of Nuclear Weapons, it would be especially important for the United States and the other nuclear armed states to be called upon to explain the legal rationale and the practical effects of their nuclear weapons employment plans at the 2015 NPT Review Conference. So the second idea I'd like to put forward is the idea of exploring a ban on the use of nuclear weapons. Now, let me preface this by noting that when we talk about bans on nuclear weapons, you might think of them in four different categories, and I'm going to be talking particularly about one of these. So one idea is a ban treaty that outlines in great detail all of the steps that would be necessary to lead to the verifiable elimination of nuclear weapons. Another variation would be a ban on the possession and use of nuclear weapons. That could be a one-sentence treaty, if you will. Another variation would be a ban on the use of nuclear weapons, which is what I'll talk about a little bit here. And yet another variation might be a treaty that calls upon or requires nuclear armed states to respect a policy of no first use. So these are all variations on the ban theme, but I think it's important as we talk about moving towards a ban on nuclear weapons that we think about the differences and the distinctions between these, because each one of them has different political dynamics, practical effects, and different tactics that we need to think about as they're each pursued. So, in my view, one implication of the catastrophic global effects of even a relatively small number of nuclear weapons is that nuclear weapons should not ever be used. We're here in the U.S. Institute of Peace. We're in the Frank Carlucci Room Conference Center. He was a member of Ronald Reagan's administration. And President Ronald Reagan once said, quote, "A nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought." I would agree with President Reagan very much on that point. So a very logical way for responsible states to address the NPT action plan goals of diminishing the role and significance of nuclear weapons and assuring non-nuclear weapon states against the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons would be to begin exploring options for a legally binding instrument banning the use of nuclear weapons. So this was, if you recall, I doubt many of you recall because none of us were alive at the time, the 1925 Geneva Protocols, which addressed chemical and biological weapons after World War I. Those protocols said that their use had been justly condemned by the general opinion of the civilized world, and that this prohibition on biological chemical weapons use shall be universally accepted, binding alike the conscience and the practice of nations. So the negotiation of such a ban on the use of nuclear weapons could take place in a dedicated diplomatic forum, possibly to be established by the UN General Assembly in the next 2, 3, 4 years. And it could begin with the establishment of a group of governmental experts to begin looking at the legal and the political and the practical issues of such a ban exercise. Now, even if the nuclear weapon states do not initially join in the negotiation or sign such an instrument, the process itself, I would argue, and the final product would, in the very least, help to delegitimize nuclear weapons, promote a robust, serious debate on nuclear use doctrines, and help strengthen the delicate legal and political barriers against the use of nuclear weapons. Such an approach, in my view, and we can talk about this in greater detail in the Q&A, would have a greater chance of winning broad international support than a treaty banning the possession and use of nuclear weapons. And I would just note quickly that some states have already put forward the idea of a treaty banning the use of nuclear weapons, including India, which of course possesses nuclear weapons. Now, let me turn to a third main area, which are specific actions that could accelerate the so-called step-by-step nuclear disarmament process. With progress towards most of the 2010 NPT action plan steps at a near standstill, I think it's important to be thinking about how we can jumpstart the process. And the first thing that I think is important to consider is that even after the New START treaty is fully implemented, the U.S. and Russia will still have nuclear weapons stockpiles that far exceed any plausible, defensible level for nuclear deterrence. In fact, as we heard Anita Fried say this morning, President Obama has already determined that the United States could move our deployed nuclear arsenal levels down to 1,000 or 1,100 nuclear weapons tomorrow. That's what he has determined is necessary for U.S. defense deterrence purposes. So with New START verification tools in place, further reductions involving U.S. and Russian stockpiles need not wait for a new formal negotiation. President Obama could accelerate the pace of reductions under New START ahead of the 2018 implementation deadline. Yes, it would cost some money, not a lot. It could be done. We just heard earlier this month that the United States and Russia have already come pretty close to the 1,550 ceiling established by New START. Russia is already below the limit, 700 strategic delivery vehicles today. So it's possible for the United States to accelerate the pace of progress under New START, and that would be a very useful, good faith contribution to the United States effort on disarmament ahead of the 2015 NPT review conference. So long as Russia takes reciprocal steps, and Russia is already below the United States' overall deployed nuclear warheads level, President Obama could also say that he will continue to further reduce U.S. nuclear force levels so long as Russia continues to do so. And for both countries, this is cost effective because, as I said, the cost of maintaining this very large stockpile of nuclear weapons robs both countries of the ability to deal with other more important priorities. And so this type of policy, this type of approach could encourage Russia to build down rather than to build up its nuclear force levels in the coming years. And that's even more important as the relations between the two countries continue to worsen after the crisis in Ukraine. Now, the other thing that's important to reconsider, it's been around for a long time, is the idea of adjusting the nuclear readiness posture of some of the